Next week promises to be another big week for the Supreme Court, with another set of rulings set to come down on Monday. Over the past 10 days, the court dealt defeats to the Trump administration over LGBTQ rights and also the Dreamer program. And the justices, they still have an abortion case, plus Trump's tax returns on the docket for this term. And next term, the High Court will hear arguments about Obamacare, the administration trying to end the Affordable Care Act, even though we are again in the middle of a pandemic. I want to bring in our guest, Amy Howe. She is a Supreme Court reporter who contributes to SCOTUS blog, and I spoke to her earlier this week. Let's take a look at the Louisiana abortion case and some of the other cases coming down the pike. We saw what Tennessee did with the fetal heartbeat, etc. They are trying clearly to get the Supreme Court to revisit Roe. Give our audience an idea. When the court approaches these, are they trying to narrowly define it, or are they open, if not almost agreeable, to revisit Roe entirely? What would it take to have a broad reinterpretation potentially of that decision?
So I want to separate. I think it's a great question. I want to separate the Louisiana abortion case, which is the one they have before them right now, and that is a challenge to a Louisiana law that requires doctors who perform abortions to have the right to admit patients at nearby hospitals. And the challengers who are an abortion clinic and doctors who perform abortions in Louisiana say, look, this is just like a law in Texas that the Supreme Court struck down 2 years ago. And so this should be an easy case. You struck that law down. You said it was unconstitutional because it's going to make it too hard for women to obtain an abortion. So you should strike this one down too. So Roe versus Wade is not at issue in the cases before the Supreme Court right now. But what it could give us an idea about is what the Supreme Court, as it's currently constituted, because the Supreme Court has changed a lot, is what the Supreme Court sort of thinks about these older cases. And then as far as cases like the Tennessee case, the heartbeat bills, those are decisions that are there because legislatures are trying to get the Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade. But the president campaigned on a promise to put justices on the Supreme Court who would overturn Roe versus Wade. And whether or not there are 5 votes to overturn it may be a different matter. I'm not sure that the Chief Justice, John Roberts, maybe is there yet, but there, you can overturn a ruling that's 40 years old, almost 50 years old. You can also sort of whittle away at it. The test for whether or not an abortion law is unconstitutional is whether or not it places an undue burden on a woman's right to obtain an abortion. And so, you may be in a scenario in which the Supreme Court doesn't overturn Roe versus Wade, but looks at a law and says, no, that doesn't place an undue burden on a woman's right to obtain an abortion. No, that law doesn't either. So we could know a lot more, though, when they decide this Louisiana case about sort of what the current 5 more conservative justices think about sort of these older abortion cases and how they're going to approach them.
You're obviously a very keen observer, Amy, in terms of the Chief Justice. Do I read too much into it that he clearly seems very concerned that the court not be seen as a political arm of the 3 branches, that it is an independent and they fairly call balls and strikes? And the perception of the public otherwise to it, especially, after the recount election, he seems very concerned about the perception of it. Now, Dahlia Lithwick wrote a really interesting piece. And I know it's not up to the Supreme Court to manage the Attorney General by any means, but because the contention was that Barr was so indifferent to the perception of independence and propriety coming out of DOJ, and they are the ones that are putting cases before the court, et cetera, that there could be an intersection, especially with this upcoming election, and some of the cases, including Trump's financial records, where he could be playing the Attorney General with fire a little bit, keep putting the High Court in political situations. Do you believe any of that factors in when Justice Roberts is deciding not only in a 5-4 case, but also the court's role in terms of the general public as a nonpartisan arm here as much as possible?
I think he's more concerned about public perceptions about the court as an institution than the other conservative justices. And so that maybe, help to explain his vote, for example, on the Obamacare case. And I certainly think it helps to explain two of the defeats for the Trump administration in the past 2 years, and the challenge to the decision to try to put a question about citizenship on the 2020 census, and then the challenge to the Trump administration's effort to try to end DACA. In both the census case and the DACA case, Roberts didn't say the Trump administration can't do that. He just said, basically, you've got to go about it the right way. And the Trump administration, in essence, was sloppy in how they did it.
To that end, and I've heard people say there's a merit to where I'm going with this and that I'm flat out wrong. But when you see cases, and I think you said it better than I could, and what the ruling said and what they didn't say vis-a-vis DACA and the LGBTQ ruling, that progressives get kind of nervous when they see those two rulings, because Roberts is keenly aware how, as you said, the court is viewed, that you throw two rulings this way, expect the next big case, let's say, coming down the pipe will go the opposite direction. Is there a consciousness, not only in picking cases, but in doing so, that both parties will be getting something at the end of the day that they can turn around and say the court isn't one way or the other, even though obviously he's a conservative justice and more often than not the court will rule that way? Is there a method here to not only which cases to take, but also how some are decided?
You look at DACA, you look at the citizenship case, both of those are cases in which the federal government lost below. So it's no surprise at all that they decided to take them up. In terms of this idea that they're sort of, they're throwing the progressives a little bit of a bone, and now they're going to issue some more conservative decisions. The Title VII case and a little bit of this is just timing. The Title VII case was argued back in October. It was one of the very first cases that was argued. The DACA case was in November. The Louisiana abortion wasn't until February. The Trump tax returns wasn't until May. So it's not surprising that those decisions would come out a little bit later, however they wind up coming out. And they may wind up, we don't know yet, they may wind up coming out with a more conservative bent. But I don't think that sort of in terms of how, certainly Roberts, it's convenient. I think it works out well for him if that the court winds up looking kind of balanced in its decisions, that there aren't these stories about the Roberts court with the sharp move to the right. But particularly if you look at DACA, all that the Supreme Court said in that case was that the Trump administration didn't go about it the right way. They didn't say that they couldn't try again. And there is still a separate case in which Texas and a couple of other so-called red states are challenging the DACA program itself in federal court, arguing that President Barack Obama didn't have the authority under federal law to implement the program in the first place. So certainly Roberts handed the federal government, the Trump administration, a defeat in DACA, but it may not be, I think, quite as sweeping as many people are playing it.
Amy, I appreciate a few minutes. Thank you so much. Up next, an important topic that doesn't get the attention it frankly deserves. I'm talking about rape kits. After this break, we're going to show you why thousands of victims are not getting justice due to issues involving processing those kits.